We are so pleased for you to join us this evening on this very special night, which we brought good weather for you. Yes. We didn't think you'd enjoy snow, so we brought this kind of weather instead. We'll give everyone just a moment to get off the buses.
Well, folks, we welcome you to Voices of the Past. Please come in. And we're going to walk a bit right up so you can meet our first resident. Mount Mora Cemetery is very old, you know, and we have many thousand people here. Fascinating stories. You'll hear some this evening.
Oh, I see that we have our first resident. And she is, well, she's not a resident.
We'll gather around so everyone can hear. We'll wait until you all kind of make a semicircle so that you can all hear her.
Bonsoir. Comment va tout le monde ce soir? Oh, it must be English. I'm sorry. You met my husband just a little while ago. Joseph Rubidoux is my husband. And I would have loved to have been there to welcome you personally to St. Joseph and to Mount Mora. But this is my first time at Mount Mora, and my son Edmund is buried here, and I wanted an opportunity to visit with him and see his grave and talk to his family, so I decided to come here instead. I know that my husband Joseph Rubidoux shared some information with you, but he's really kind of a private person, and he may not have told you that he was actually married twice, at least, before he married me. There are rumors of others, but we won't talk about that. His first wife was Eugenie Delisle Rubidoux. He married her in 1801. He himself was only 18 years old at the time. They had twins, Therese Caroline, and a son, Eugene Joseph. The twins tragically died very young, so it wasn't a good thing. But when Eugene Joseph was being baptized, the priest looked at the parents and said, you know, his name ought to be Joseph Eugene. So they did change his name to Joseph E., and that's how he was known ever after. My husband's second marriage was to a Native American woman here in St. Joseph. They had two children, a daughter and a son. The daughter was named Mary Many Days, and the son was Joseph, whom my husband called Indian Joe. You're going to notice there are a lot of Josephs in the Rubidoux clan. It's a name that comes up pretty frequently. Mary Many Days married a Native American gentleman named Mahaska, whose Christian name was Francis Whitecloud, and he later became Chief Whitecloud, whom I believe you also met this evening when you met my husband. My husband spent a lot of time traveling up and down the Missouri River. He loved exploration, and he worked closely with the American Fur Company, trading with the Native American tribes. He did take a break from his trade on the Missouri River, and he returned to St. Louis, which is his birthplace, and that's where we met. I was originally from Vincennes, Indiana, but I had moved to St. Louis with my family. And in 1813, Joseph and I were married. I mentioned my son Edmund first, but we had 7 other children. We had Frederick, Felix, Francis,
It's not working.
No.
Nope.
I'm not getting a sound.
No.
I'm back.
The children, besides Edmund, were named Frederick, Francis, Felix, Mazzani, Charles, Julius, and a daughter Sylvani. Well, Sylvani is how it's spelled, but we called her Sylvani. Charles was the only one of our children actually born here in St. Joseph. He was born in 1831, but tragically, he died when he was only 20 years old. He was mistaken for someone breaking into a shop to rob it, and so he was shot and killed in 1851. Ironically, 1851 is the date that Mount Mora opened as a cemetery, but Charles couldn't be buried here because we're Catholic. And at that time, it was tradition to bury Catholics in the Calvary Cemetery across town. So that's the reason Charles was there. Edmund was buried here because at the time of his passing, and he was the last of our children to pass, that the cemetery, the Calvary Cemetery, had fallen into horrible disrepair. And so they thought Mount Mora would be a better location for their grave. My husband continued to trade on the Missouri River. He belonged, like I say, he was employed by the American Fur Company. He had a little falling out with them for a few years, and they made him sign a non-compete agreement, which he was happy to do. But at the end of 3 years, the American Fur Company wanted him back because he was very good at what he did. They offered him a post here in St. Joseph at Roy's Branch, which he opened in 1826, and the American Fur Company paid him the princely sum of $1,800 a year to operate that branch. But now by 1830, my husband felt like he really wanted to go out on his own, so he established yet another post at Black Snake Creek here in St. Joseph, which he operated for a number of years very, very successfully. Now, personally, I was not fond of the wilderness, which is what this was at that time, so I stayed in St. Louis for the most part, and he stayed in St. Joseph. But we took turns traveling back and forth to see each other. And Joseph was very tolerant. He completely understood and was very forgiving of my need to be near more civilization. Anyway, I also had a sister, Suzanne Boudre, who ended up marrying Joseph's younger brother, Michel. Just interesting fact. To finish my story, I finally died on January 1937 here in St. Joseph, and I was buried, like the rest of my family, in Calvary Cemetery. Those of you from St. Joe might know that Calvary Cemetery fell into bad disrepair and then ultimately was closed, and most of the people buried there were moved to Mount Olivet. And so most of the Ruby Doo clan, but not all, are in Mount Olivet. Anyway, I'm so glad we had an opportunity to talk, and I think I'll go visit with my son Edmund now. So, bonsoir and merci.
And I would like for you now to meet this gentleman. My goodness, so nice to see you, General.
Good evening. Benjamin Franklin Loan. I've been invited here tonight to regale you with tales and details of earliest days of St. Joseph. When I arrived here in October of 1843, it was my good fortune to be the first attorney here present in St. Joseph. As a result, I acquired a great deal of very prominent men to list as my clients. In 1845, there were 7 men that were elected to be the trustees for the city of St. Joseph. Joseph Ruby Doo was quickly chosen to be the chairman, and being the only attorney, he quickly nominated me to be the city clerk and the city attorney. In that position, I was able to put forward many of the ideas that were laid out by my friend Frederick Smith in the plans for St. Joseph. For example, they were building a riverboat wharf at the foot of Francis Street, but the river unfortunately kept taking the landing away. So the council was flustered, but I came up with this plan. In the wintertime, we took and built a crib out upon the ice, filled it with sand and rock, and when it becomes sufficient weight, it sank. Over the course of the winter, sand built up against the obstruction, and it diverted the current away long enough so that we could build a permanent riverboat wharf there at the foot of Francis Street. Next in line, there was the Black Snake Creek. It was still wild and woolly. Every temporary bridge across the creek was taken away. I think it's louder. So we built a permanent structure across Black Snake Creek, and it was the first time the public coffers were open to do something for the public. So once that was done, we were able to connect Main Street with the Market Square area, and unfortunately, though it was there on the plat, the Market Square didn't exist yet. So we opened the public coffers again and built the Market House, is commonly known as Market Square. In 1846, I began my real passion and began connecting St. Joseph to the Mississippi River by way of rail. I would travel all over the state of Missouri and solicit anyone that would listen to get them on my side to build a railroad to connect St. Joseph with Mississippi. I convinced the businessmen, the citizens, anybody that would listen, and through this endeavor, this great group of people came together and we made the system happen, and we brought the Hannibal St. Joseph Railroad to St. Joseph in 1858. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you good evening.
Okay, we will make our way up Mount Mora Road now for our next guest. Here to your right at the Toothacre Monument. Good evening, sir. Give our group just a bit of time to move up this way, and I'll have you introduce yourself.
Well, now I guess everybody can hear me. Yep. All right. I'm Joseph Davis, and I've been here about 177 years. My wife and I, we came here in 1841 from Indiana, and I preempted some land in the north area of the town, which became known as the Davis Tract. And in the early days, I made my living as a hunter, trader, trapper, guide, scout. And then I began to raise hemp for making ropes. And as I began to make great hemp. And then I made a lot of money by selling supplies to the wagon trains. There were tons of them that came through here. And also being a landowner and then a dealer in mortgages. Well, I had one son by my first marriage and lost that life, as so often happened. But then my wife, my next wife, Allie, and I had 11 children, which I would guess most of you out there don't have that many. It was nothing unusual in those days, and this isn't working.
This ain't working.
Let's try this hand. That's not going to help. Well, anyway, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. And anyway, we had 11 children, and I can tell you that I loved them most of the time. Now, there's some times that I wasn't quite sure, especially with this next story that I'm going to tell you. My son Dick, who was full of mischief and 11 years old, he had a friend whose name was Josiah Moss, and JB, as he was called. They decided to come up with a little plan, and they went over to the fairgrounds. And at the time, the fairgrounds were full of Union troops, and they begged some cartridges from the Union troops. Well, there was a Sunday came up, and the neighbors got in their carriage to go on to church like good St. Josephans were supposed to do, although I'm not sure I did that all the time. But anyway, they went on to church, and so JB and my son Dick went over to the neighbor's yard. Well, apparently Dick had a mini ball about the size of a marble. Now, mini balls were the bullets that were used in musket loading guns. Well, anyway, Dick and JB got over to the Walworth's house, and the Walworth's house was kind of an unusual house because it was perfectly square, and it had windows opposite each other on all sides. So that was the way the house looked. Well, JB looks through the house, through the windows, because he can see from one window through the next one. And so he decides to throw the mini ball over to JB. Well, smashola, there goes two windows. And JB doesn't want to be outdone, so he's going to throw it back. And he breaks two more. Before they get done, they have broken all of the windows on the east and the west side. Now you can imagine what they did next. Yep, that's right. North and south was beckoning. And so they go over to the north and south side and start throwing that mini ball again until this time it ends up on the floor in the middle of the house, so they can't break up any more windows. But they did a pretty good job with most of them. Well, when the Walworths, so that was the name of the neighbors, came home, they figured that all that damage had been done by the Union troops who were by there. That was until somebody spilled the beans and said, you know, I saw your son over there in the Walworth yard, and he was throwing around something. So Mr. Walworth comes over and he blames this on my son Dick. Well, you could tell that Dick wasn't going to own up to it, but you didn't have to have any kind of special instrument to know that he was guilty. So what happened is I whaled him to a far thee well. And it turned out that I didn't know that JB had been involved too, or there would have been two lickings that day instead of just one. Well, I paid for all the damage, but Dick, he learned a good lesson. You know those kids, they'll keep you busy, especially when you got 12. But anyway, I'll tell you one more unusual story. This one is not so funny, but it is unusual. I had a brother, Richard. In fact, I'm not sure that we didn't name Dick after Richard, but I don't remember so many of them ago. But anyway, Richard had been found unable to handle his own affairs by the court. So I had been appointed as guardian of his estate. Well, my health began to fail, and so I was made party to a lawsuit for $3,000 that I was to pay to the new guardian of the estate. Now, this $3,000 had been given to me by my father to pay the interest to Richard. Well, what happened, as usual, when you have no luck but bad luck, somebody broke into the home and stole all the money before I could make any disposition of it. But that didn't stop me. Over time, I paid all of the principal plus the interest, $3,846. But still, there was a court order against me that said that I had to pay the $3,000 again. Well, I knew I wasn't guilty and I wasn't going to pay it twice, so I ended up being in confinement. And I knew that I had paid everything plus more, so I wasn't about to admit anything, and guess what? That confinement played heck with my health. And before I knew it, I had passed away. And I passed away in my home that was known as Maple Grove, which it's still there now if you go down to Douglas and 11th Street. Yeah, that's it, Douglas and 11th Street. And it was a grand place in the day. Why don't you go by and take a look? Well, I just wanted to give you a little few stories other than this recitation of history that you've been hearing and you're going to hear. Just to tell you that unusual and funny things happened way back then, just like it probably happens today. Well, thank you for being here, and I need to head up to the section B because that's where my permanent sleeping place is. Thanks.
There are 21 mausoleums off Mausoleum Road, but there are 9 others scattered through the center. So you're welcome to drive in any other time and drive around and notice the beautiful architecture. I think we were going to stop here, but I don't see a character. Do we have someone? Oh, my
Bonsoir. Enchanté. Excuse-moi. Good evening. Very nice to meet you. I grew up speaking French, but I will speak the English for you. I was just now paying my respects to an old friend, Edmond. He was the son of Joseph Robidoux, oui? Yes. We shared many pleasant times along the banks of Black Snake Creek. Like my father, I was a trapper and fur trader in Saint Louis, the city of my birth. My father, Francois Deronay, was also a fur trader. My mother, she was confined as a slave, but I know little about her. You see, the records of my people were oftentimes not kept, and since we were not allowed to read or write, many accounts of our early years have gone by the wayside. Take my name, Jeffrey D. Ronay, for instance. It has been spelled and pronounced this way and that by whoever is speaking. D. Ronay is how the French would say it. But most of you would say De Royn, the Americans. You may have met Joseph Robidoux earlier this evening. He established his trading post not far from here, in the Black Snake Hills, near the river of the big canoes. He went about setting out a city, one that now bears his name. He also spoke the French. I came with him from Saint Louis and worked as a slave at his trading post. The work was hard, moving heavy crates loaded with goods, pelts, traded by the Iowa, Oto, Dakota, and Osage. We traded with them often, and I learned to speak their language. I also learned your language, which I am speaking tonight. I cannot tell you Robidoux was a kind slave master, if such a thing is even possible. In fact, he was very often unkind, including beatings. Many times I considered running away, but the time and conditions were not right. At that time, Kansas, the land beyond the river, had not been made a free state. And besides, I had decided to follow the legal system established to protect the rights of the people. When I was 16 years old, my grandmother, Rachel Camp, filed a lawsuit on my behalf to show that I was not his slave. I was not of age to file for myself. However, Robidoux had much money and many friends, and he was able to prevail. After many years, my attempt failed. But that was not the end of my story. My time working with the native peoples would provide an unexpected benefit. In my dealings with the tribes, I had come to know an Iowa chief, Francis White Cloud, and his friend Andrew Hughes, a government agent appointed to keep the peace between the Ioways and other nearby tribes. Because I understood the words of the native people, I was hired by the government as a translator. I did my job well, and Agent Hughes, recognizing the value of my service to the government, worked out an arrangement whereby Chief White Cloud provided funds to secure my freedom from Joseph Rubidoux to work for the Iowa. I was 26 years old and I was free. One of the agreements I worked on was a treaty that you may have heard of, called the Platte Purchase. In 1836, after enduring the continuing encroachment upon the lands by the waves of settlers, leaders of the Iowa, Sac, and Fox Nation were weary of fighting and bloodshed, and they could see the writing on the wall. And sold their lands and reservations, sold their land for a reservation in the Kansas Territory near White Cloud. The purchase became known as the Platte Purchase, and out of it was created the counties of Holt, Platte, Atchison, Andrew, and Buchanan, where we are today. I was a part of those negotiations, and my X is on that paper. The X because even though I spoke many languages, I was never able to learn to write. During all those years as a translator for the Iowa, I toured many European cities and met a number of famous people, including French monarch, King Louis Philippe and the royal family, British statesman Benjamin Disraeli, author activist George Sand. She was magnifique. And novelist Victor Hugo. One year I traveled in Europe with 14 Iowa and American artist George Catlin, who did paintings and drawings of Native Americans. In fact, the picture of me that has survived was done by Catlin in 1844. If you go to the St. Joseph Museum on Frederick Avenue, you will see a copy in the Black Archives Museum on the second floor. My life has had its share of hard times, yes. But one thing for which I am grateful is the $50 per year for life that I received from the Iowa in the deal negotiated by Chief White Cloud. With those monies, I bought 160-acre farm near Forest City, and I farmed for several years with my wife from the Iowa Nation. Payonote Wiwa Kishethwa, which means in the language of the Red Earth people, reach for the sun. Much later, with the money I had saved, I was able to purchase freedom for a slave woman, and we were married. I moved from the farm, spending the rest of my days here in this city, where I again worked as a trader. When I died, I left to my forebears an estate worth several $1,000s, very unusual for a black man and former slave. And this was in the days before Mr. Lincoln proclaimed freedom for those unjustly oppressed. Well, I'll take no more of your time, but thank you for listening to this old fur trader, statesman, and world traveler.
We so appreciate your sharing your story. Well, we'll walk on up, Mausoleum Row.
Strange black stick in my hand. So very new. But nice to see a big crowd. This is really quite a lovely place here. First time I've been here. You see, I am Mrs. John F. Shortridge, and I'm the wife of the first known burial here in this cemetery. At the time my husband passed, he was living with our daughter and son-in-law. Oh, you may have met them. That's Jane Ann and Simeon Kemper. Well, at that time, when my husband passed, they buried him here, but this was far, far out in the country, and it wasn't even land that they owned. It was 1843. My stars, 1843. Well, anyway, 1843 was the time that this fair city was founded, and it would become St. Joseph. But back in those days, it was just wilderness. Well, my husband, that was 1843. Oh, but I digress. I have to tell you a little bit about our family and our marriage. My husband, John, was an attorney, and we had a wonderful life together. We were married in February of 1810. And not long after, in November of 1810, our firstborn child, Jane Ann Kemper, who would become Kemper, was born there in Baltimore, Maryland. Well, she would be the one who, because she was our firstborn, she would be the one who would nurse me in my long illness. She was so dear, and I was so fortunate to have her to care for me. And so, at the time of my husband's, my death, she had nursed me for so long that the family recommended that she go to live with an in-law, my husband's brother's family. And so she was invited to go there to rest. And that was Montgomery County, Kentucky. Well, you know, the Lord is good, and sometimes He turns sadness into blessings. Well, as it would happen, there was a gentleman who lived down the road from her uncle, my brother-in-law, a gentleman who was both a farmer and a teacher. But the community just thought that he would just forever be a bachelor because he had already attained the great age of 27. But in any case, he took a look at my dear Jane Ann, and they fell in love, and they were married. Now, when I died, my husband decided to move away from where we were living, and he went to Tazewell, Virginia. Well, that's in the southwest part of Virginia, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But he had a pain and a disease, he thought, in his breast. And it caused him so much trouble, he was most concerned. And so he began to make a trek and move to Jackson County, Missouri, not far from here, as you know. And he wanted to live with his brother who'd invited him to come. Now his brother Samuel in Blue Township owned a 140-acre farm. That's quite a large farm for them to share. And so my husband continued to have this disease that would eventually take his life. And so in January of 1843, his son-in-law, Simeon Kemper, wrote him a letter inquiring about his health. And Simeon and Jane Ann were also inviting him to come live with them. And by then they had moved to St. Joseph. And so he decided to do just that. And of course Jane Ann, having had all that experience nursing me, claimed that she should nurse him as well. And so she did. But not for very long, as he did pass. And they brought him here and buried him in these grounds. Well, that's my story. But I am so pleased to finally get to see my long-lost husband again. And I will spend the rest of the evening sharing memories with my husband and
I am going to bid you all adieu. But thank you for sharing my story. Have a wonderful evening.
I'm so glad you had the opportunity to meet my mother. And you know, my father was the very first burial on these lands. It was before it was Mount Mora even. It was just country. Well, let's walk on up. Oh my goodness, my dearest friend, I do want you to meet this lovely lady. She is so special to me.
Thank you so much. She is such a good friend. Thank you, Jane Ann. And how lovely to see so many visitors come. I came here a long time ago. You see, I'm Melinda Keaty, and I married as a young woman to the most wonderful man. His name was Dr. Daniel G. Keaty, and he was the very first physician in St. Joseph. After he completed his medical studies, we moved here in 1843. And I must say, what a wilderness it was. Well, I'm wondering how many of you find it difficult to sleep at night with the howl of the wolves so loud and fierce. Why, sometimes it was incessant, making it impossible to sleep. Not something I ever really got used to. But then the people that settled this, excuse me, I think I'm pushing buttons. Is that better? Okay. The people that settled this territory were hard-working and determined, and we had much by day to keep us busy and tire us for night. But I must say, sometimes at first I was a bit lonely, until one day I recall going out to milk our cow. Not a frontier duty that I miss at all. But on this morning I encountered a gentleman who had noted that I was a newcomer, and he very politely introduced himself as Mr. Simeon Kemper. And I explained that Dr. Keaty and I were newly from Maryland. Mr. Kemper very kindly requested to return on the morrow with his wife, whom he said was also from Maryland, and he thought she might enjoy meeting someone of similar interests. Just as promised, I saw them coming the next day on horseback, and Mrs. Kemper sat behind her husband, Jane Ann, with her parasol over her head. It looked just like the Queen was coming to visit me. I was so excited to have a visitor. She was so lovely, and we became good friends for many years. But as I said, there was much by day to keep us busy. Dr. Keaty and I had 8 children, so you can imagine how I spent my days. My husband also had a sawmill that he directed down near the river bottoms. It was quite common back then for people to have more than one occupation because there was just so much to do to build this new town. So including his children and his sawmill and his demanding medical practice, my husband also sought to be integral in the good progress of our town. It was such an extraordinary time, and we were so blessed and so happy, but it was too short. My husband's death took me quite by surprise. He was ill for just one short week, and then he passed in 1851, not quite 9 years after we first came here. I remember a quote from his obituary said, "In the battle and fierce progress that always ensues on the settlement of a new territory, he occupied no doubtful position." I was very proud of that because my husband was one of the few that fought to suppress vice. And it was a fight that kept him quite busy sometimes in this town. Another quote said, "One note of his bugle was worth 1,000 men." He was remembered as a gentleman and leader and pillar of the community. I missed him so much, as did the children. He was also sorely missed by the community, having treated many of the first families, including the Kempers, and our colorful, irascible founder, Mr. Joseph Rubidoux, and his interesting family. I lived on to the age of 81, never did remarry, but I was blessed to still have 6 of my 8 children with me. I passed at the turn of the century in 1899. Oh, wait, that wouldn't have been last century, but the century before. Why, Jane Ann, you know I was born in 1818, and it was, what year is it now? 2018, so that was 2 centuries ago. I would say St. Joseph has changed a bit since I was here. Indeed, I hear no wolves, and that is progress. I would like to thank you for coming this evening. It's been a joy to stand before you and see a future that I could never have imagined. Good evening.
Okay, if you will turn your attention straight ahead to this most magnificent mausoleum at the top of the hill, we will hear from our next guest.
I welcome you here. My name is Simeon Kemper, and you have come to a place that's very dear to my heart. This is the first opportunity I've had to talk with visitors. My wife Jane Ann has visited with you, but this is a first for me. I know you've heard from some others this evening, and I knew them all, some better than others. You see, we arrived here on December 22nd, 1839, and that meant that we were able to witness and experience the transformation of Black Snake Hills into St. Joseph. When we first arrived, we stayed with Joseph Rubin, and that was quite common. That was quite common, that he would provide lodging for people who arrived here but hadn't yet established homes for themselves. And we'd already experienced that when we first came to this region. We landed at Liberty Landing, and that's where we got off the boat. And we were first in Clay County and then in Clinton County. And travelers would come by, and they would expect to stay with us. And there were times when we had as many as 14 other people under our roof. And that's one of the main reasons that I rode by horseback to Black Snake Hills to seek a better place for Jane Ann and for our family. When I got here, I was taken by the beauty of the place. The 200-foot high river bluffs that stretched to what became known as the French Bottoms and down to St. Michael's Meadow. It was a beautiful land with abundant water and lush forests. And so many birds, bluebirds, orioles, all kinds. So my family came by covered wagon. It was a difficult trip for Jane Ann and for our 2 young children, Sarah Ann and also John William. By 1840, I'd constructed a double log home where 22nd and Calhoun Streets meet today. Jane Ann struggled there because, well, there were times when she would find a snake under the wildflowers, or we heard wolves howling at night. And we knew that from time to time someone would see a panther prowling around. It was challenging in those days. And it could also be sad. I bought a quarter section of land, 160 acres. And included in that parcel was the place where Jane Ann's father was buried. And within the first year of owning it, 2 of our children were buried there too. In fact, all of us rest in what became the Kemper family plot right up the hill here behind me. Our whole family rests there, except for our son, John William. John William died in the Battle of Corinth, and he rests in the South alongside others who lost their lives in that terrible war. We lost 3 of our boys in that war. And the loss that our family suffered illustrates how divisive that war was, because you see, we lost 3 sons. 2 of them fought for the Confederacy, and 1 fought for the Union. And by the time of our passing, all but 1 of our 10 children had died. So it was sad, it was challenging, but there were good things too. Jane Ann reached out to some others, 4 in particular, and they began the First Methodist Church. And it took a while, but I eventually traded my Presbyterian roots and I joined them in the church that she loved so much. When we were in Kentucky, I was a teacher. But when we came to Missouri, my profession was surveyor, and Joseph Robidoux asked me to plat our city. And I offered him a plan that included wide streets and parks. Frederick Smith also offered him a plan. It had narrow streets and more lots that could be sold, and it was always thought that Joseph chose Frederick's plan because of the additional lots and he could make more money. And that may be. But it's also quite possible that he made the decision because of what a lithographer had said, that it would be easier to etch a printing plate with straight lines rather than one that had a lot of curves and bends. You know, there were so many people coming here from the east at that time. We knew that the trip would be safer, would be faster, would just simply be better by train. And Senator Robert Stewart, who went on to become governor, selected me to be one of the men who surveyed for the Hannibal-St. Joseph Railroad. And that venture took about 6 months, took me away from here about 6 months. And I remember that when it was done, Senator Stewart asked me to ride his horse back to St. Joseph, and he went the other way to the state capitol. Jane Ann's delight was the home that we built on Clay Street. 35 magnificent rooms and gardens that people came to visit. But sadness intruded in our lives then too. You see, I had done very well financially in real estate and also as a surveyor. But the war that broke our hearts also broke us financially. And that home that she loved so much ended up being auctioned off on the courthouse steps. And we spent our remaining years with our son, Charles Shortridge Kemper, and his wife. Before I go, I want to share something with you. The name of this cemetery, Mount Mora. Because so many have asked, why that name? Well, in Spanish, the word Mora means blackberry or mulberry, and we had named one of the streets bordering our quarter section Mulberry because there were so many of those trees at that time. Now, in a very old lexicon, there's another meaning for the word Mora: stopping place or resting place. And in the Old Testament, in 2 Samuel chapter 5, there's a story about David and his army encamped in a grove of mulberry trees. And the Hebrew word that's translated mulberry tree is baka. And another way to translate the word baka is weeping tree. So there you have it. Some of my story about our wonderful life and our sad life. And now I bid you good night.
So we appreciate your wonderful description and time, Mr. Kemper. And now we have a very important special guest here at the end for you.
The timeless theme, earth and heaven will pass away. It's not a dream, God will make all things new that day. Gone is the curse from which I stumbled and fell. Evil is banished to eternal hell. crying again. Only praises to the great I am. We will live in the light of the risen Lamb. See all around, now the nations bow down to sing. The only sound are the praises to Christ the King. Slowly the names from the book are read, but I know the King, so there's no need to dread. No more night and no more pain, no more tears, never crying again. Only praises to the great I am. We will live in the light of the risen Lamb.
you.